welcome back to another episode of Saft Podcast. And Steven, welcome back.
Yes, thank you for welcoming
So,
me.
so we were just heads up. We were just working out different schedules and things that fall into place. So we decided it's easier for Steven to get back on before until Piyush gets his things sorted.
Yeah,
So good to have you back, man.
thank you.
And we are continuing with our Kalam dialogue and all that's
Yes,
happening.
sir.
So, what do you take so far on what we've been doing with the Kalam? Because we've been going very slow, like you said, we've been going bite-sized. So, what's your general take on what we've done so far?
It's very nice.
It's
What else do I
a
say?
man, a succinct word.
Yeah, well, the Kalam cosmological argument, the power in it is its simplicity, right? Just
Yeah.
simply, this is what we had discussed on the episode that we were first on, right? Where you literally have two premises and then one conclusion,
Yes.
and yes, everyone, please pay attention, because I'm very proud of myself for knowing this. So, the first premise, imagine if I get it wrong also after saying all of this, that'll be even worse. But anyway, premise one is everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, so hence the universe has a cause.
Right.
And because of the simplicity of all of this, it's very easy for us to go and verify each one. And this is a deductive argument that we're
Yes.
making, right?
Yes.
See, so proud of myself. Okay. Anyway, so the the what is it? The
The core.
unique
Yeah.
property,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Unique property.
or
What
the
USP?
very compelling property.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Or we can say USP, the unique selling point.
Yeah, USP. Yes, business terminology. Let's use that. Yeah, the unique selling point of the Kalam cosmological argument is that you have to attack those base arguments that we are first making, the first and second premises, and that is the only way that you can disprove
Yeah.
the universe began. The universe had a cause.
Right.
That
And also with its simplicity of presentation, it also has this background of research that has gone into it.
yeah.
So with the first premise, now we'll be looking at with the arguments that we can put up in defense of the first premise. There are three arguments for the first premise. And when we come to the second premise of that the universe began to exist, we have, like we mentioned, philosophical and then scientific arguments as well. So it caters to a somewhat of a broad spectrum of audience. The people who may have a philosophical inclination, to them you can appeal with that. But the people who are more easily convinced or who fall back more on scientific data, we can present the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. And so that is, like I said, it makes
It's very versatile.
it's very versatile. It makes it very unique. And so in the last episode, what we were doing is we just began exploring. And then in the last episode with Piyush on, we were talking about the difference between possibility, probability, and plausibility. Because when we were talking, you immediately asked me about what's the difference. And I was thinking on the foot, and I realized that I didn't give a proper explanation to differentiate it. So it will be helpful to the audience. Because when I first read about it, I thought, well, they were interchangeable. But there is very specific difference on when you say what. Like you don't use in the word probable whenever you feel like you use it in a very specific context. And so when you are reading through materials, right, the intent of the natural theology series is to slowly help you to understand these broad, deep arguments, and also to help you to do your own learning. So you need not always fall back on podcasts and other stuff to learn on your own. You can pick up maybe a scholarly article or a book and navigate through it at your own pace. And so what we want to do is like these casual discussion where you are the fly on the wall and you are picking up on these words that we're breaking down. So when you get to your own learning phase, you can handle that on your own. You can progress on your own. And that's how it's always going to be. We can't always depend on someone else to always give us answers. And whenever I take sessions, also I point out to the fact at the end that okay, here are the resources that you can go and learn on your own. We get questions on our social media account asking answers to stuff, and we are always there to help. But we want each person who are in that capacity to be able to do what we are also doing. We are not experts at this. We're lay people who are learning on our own, figuring out things on our own, correcting ourselves. So we all want you to be on that journey with us. So yeah, so that's what we've been touching over in the last episode. So I am looking to get into sort of like the more bulk of the KCA with this episode.
Okay, let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah. So what we're going to do in this is we're going to look at the first premise, which says,
Oh yes, yeah. Everything that began to exist has a cause.
Yeah.
Don't put me on the spot like that.
So, so what we're going to look at is what are the three arguments that are put up in defense of premise one.
Mm.
So what do you make of the premise? Like when you hear it, what are the thoughts coming to your mind?
The first thing that comes into my mind when I hear that phrase is empirical evidence or stuff that I see. Right, everything that I see that began to exist definitely had a cause. It came from something. It didn't pop into existence from nothing.
Right.
Right. So this is something that you can evidently see in
Yeah.
the world around us. Nothing that we can clearly see had no cause that began to exist.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about this premise, like you said, right, it's something that we can sort of, we'll use the term intuitively know. Like when we
Yeah.
hear, we know it intuitively, and we look at that a bit later. And which is why it is very surprising to note that there were philosophers who strongly opposed premise one. Now, this can be said as sort of like a drawback of philosophy as well, that you get too much into the weeds of the dialogue. But I think that there is also great strength in that.
Maybe into like too much into the semantics of the
Yes, right. Like when you say, like the distinction between the field of epistemology and ontology. You may be familiar with this, but ontology is the study of existence, right? What is that? That is a question of ontology.
Right.
Now, let's say you understand whatever that is. You understand that it is A. Epistemology is a study of our how we come to know about knowledge, right? So then you okay, how did you come to know that it is A? Now, for us, when we realize what is A, we just we move on. We okay, I've learned this is so and so, and we move on. But then it's in the field of philosophy that you get in nuance. Okay, how did you come to know that this is so and so? So there is, yeah. So there is great merit in that. There is great strength in that because every field has a philosophy of its own. Now, we have mentioned about this when we had, if I recall, Kenneth Samples on when we were talking about philosophy of science, and when we had Dr. Greig on, we were talking about philosophy and theology. And so in my conversation with Paul Gould, I think we mentioned this maybe in one of our prior episodes also, where there is philosophy undergirding almost every field. So Paul Gould, who is overseeing the philosophy program at Palm Beach Atlantic University, he said that there is philosophy of literature, right? Because it is also just like economics, biology, science. It is also a field that also has undergirding assumptions on how you progress through navigating Shakespeare's writing and so on and so forth. So like I said, that is a great strength of philosophy. But then also it sort of at some point makes us wonder: is it worth getting into all of these? Like you said, is it worth getting into semantics?
Yeah, but then one other thing also, I just wanted to ask, like very quickly, by philosophy of literature, what I am understanding in my mind is what literature in general, when we're studying literature, what we're trying to understand is the what and the how. What philosophy goes into is the why.
So it was the very first time that I came to know that literature had a philosophy of literature discipline. So it is, I am also as new to it as you are. But I think knowing that economics has a philosophy behind it, like this philosophy of economics. And recently I started my study into a brilliant economist, Daniel Hausman's book, Philosophy of Economics and Anthology. So in that, the focus on that is when you are starting to study about the choices of human behavior and all of that stuff in economics, you're going to have certain assumptions at the ground. Now, why do you have those assumptions? How do you know that those assumptions are valid? What are the ways that you can advance on that assumptions? And it's once those assumptions are set that you make the next step forward. So the father of economics, Adam Smith, he was a moral philosopher. David Hume was a moral philosopher who had voice in economics. John Stuart Mills was a political economist and was a philosopher. And so all of this this was in the early stage. Right now, you don't see philosophy of economics as a dominant field. Right now, we have moved more towards what is sometimes referred to as engineering economics, right? Where you have econometrics and statistics are all coming together, and you have behavioral economics also moving towards the side of economics and psychology and all of that. But when they were initially starting off, they had to come to terms of, when we say the market, what do we mean by the market? When I say choices, okay, what exactly, how do we identify what constitutes a choice and what doesn't constitute a choice? When I'm talking about human behavior, are humans going to behave in a way that is going to be driven by self-interest, or are they going to behave in ways that is driven by altruistic choices?
Okay, and this is the philosophy.
This is the philosophy part. So it's once these areas were laid down that Adam Smith and others could progress forward. So even now when economics is undergoing revision through fields like behavioral economics and new institutional economics, there's a lot that philosophers are coming and doing and giving the groundwork for it, so that someone from another field like statistics can come in and apply mathematics and as such to it. In the same way, literature also has got to have something of that sort. Like when you come into terms with the understanding of how um, you come to terms with whatever Shakespeare wrote in the context of what was written at that time. So what framework do you construct to make sure that you aren't overshooting the limits? Or what framework do you construct to make sure that you aren't putting words into what Shakespeare was trying to do? Else, you may, like how we differentiate between exegesis and eisegesis of biblical hermeneutics.
Oh, okay, yeah, let's.
Yeah, like
into what this.
exegesis is when you are simply put, you're letting the text speak for itself. Eisegesis is when you're reading into the text. So exegesis is what we want to do. We want the text to speak for itself. Eisegesis is when we are reading into the text. So when you're trying to understand what Shakespeare was trying to write, you will also need to make this differences in methodology. Like till what distance can you go with this method? At what point is that going to be not a viable methodology to understand what Shakespeare is doing? Anyway, we're going off tangents, but so that is what would be, I think that's what is going to be happening in the field of philosophy of literature, because every field has to have these principal frameworks built up so that people can correspond and take the step forward. And this is something that has been realized way back, if I recall right, in German philosophical and scientific setting, where it's called, there's a term used to refer to, it's called Weltanschauung. It reminds of Dwight saying perfect slang in the office. So Weltanschauung is a terminal that is used to refer to the, I'm just going to put it out very brutally and simply, it just refers to the theoretical paradigm within which you are operating, right?
Whoa.
So it means what are the theories that you are holding on to, which gives you a box to operate within.
Okay.
Right? So when you are doing some sort of a research, right, there you will hold, for example, if when it comes to quantum mechanics, you have different forms of interpretation of how quantum mechanics happens. You have deterministic model, indeterministic model, Copenhagen interpretation, so on and so forth. So you will be operating within a specific set of theoretical setups that is going to guide the way you're going to operate. Now, another person who may not hold on to this one particular form of interpretation of quantum mechanics is going to have a different paradigm. So the idea was that, the initial thought was that, or maybe scientists all have different boxes of their own that they can't communicate to each other. But then that has gone revision and changes and so on and so forth. So in setting up this Weltanschauung to operate, I'm pretty sure I'm butchering that word. Weltanschauung, it's SCHAUNG, something like that. So every field has those set of theoretical frameworks within which you're going to operate. Just like science has a philosophy of science, right?
Right.
Biology has a philosophy of biology. We have people like Paul Nelson and others.
So the philosophy sets up those
boundaries to navigate those questions that
operate.
that field necessarily can't.
Yeah.
And so so that's
What is that setup for KCA?
So we were talking about how philosophers were getting in too much into the weeds of it, right?
Yeah.
And like I said, it is getting into that semantics a bit further than what we may necessarily like. That helps us to talk about things that we couldn't normally do with our normal language.
Okay.
Right?
What does that mean?
Because, for example, so J L Mackie comes up and says, so this is a good place to start. So J L Mackie is a atheist philosopher, and he comes and says, okay, you're saying the premise one is everything that begins to exist has a cause. So he comes up and he cites David Hume, like I mentioned before, moral philosopher, economist, political commentator, all of that stuff. He comes up and says, we can certainly conceive, right? Draw up in our mind, imagine, those different words. We can conceive in our mind an uncaused beginning to be of an object. So that object it is about to begin, but it is uncaused.
How does that work?
Yeah, that is the question. How does that work? But J L Mackie is saying that, can you conceive in your mind? Like right now, can you imagine Michael Scott popping in the corner of the room? Like,
No.
can you imagine that?
No.
I'm not asking you to, can you bring actually him to life? No, I'm asking, can you imagine that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we can imagine that. Right? All it has to do is we have our imagination of how popping into effect
Yeah.
comes to take place, or maybe you can have a like a short sort of like translucent to opaque shift
Yeah,
effect, and then you see.
but all of this is derived from our experience of what is
Yeah,
it, CGI in films
yes,
and
all of
stuff.
that, right. But J L Mackie says that can you conceive of something of that sort?
Yeah,
And he then goes on to say, well, if that is the case, then you have to show me that that can't really happen. But the issue is like now as we explore it, we all figure out just because you can conceive something to happen doesn't mean it will really happen.
yeah, but then don't they make the same arguments for the teapot argument as well, and the spaghetti monster, just because you can't see it. But now he's using it
No,
in
no,
the
no,
opposite sense.
it's not seeing. So this is what I said. Right now you're trying to figure out what J L Mackie is trying to say, right?
Yeah,
This is the part of philosophy. Philosophy gets into semantics. Philosophy gets into the wheel. So what J L Mackie is saying is that I can conceive that something can begin to exist uncaused.
okay.
Okay. Now, what does it mean to conceive? Is that I can draw up, simply put, I can draw up in my mind. I can imagine.
Yeah.
I can conceive in my mind that something of that sort can happen.
Right, and this is to disprove the fact that everything that did
Yes.
begin to exist.
And yes, so what he's saying is that, okay, I can conceive that something can come into being from nothing.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, well, now you have to show me that this is truly impossible.
Okay.
So that the counter object that you asked, which you said out right in the beginning, like how does that work?
Yeah.
Right? The thing is, I can conceive Dora the Explorer popping in this room.
Yeah.
You can conceive Santa Claus popping in this room.
Yeah.
But that gives us no rational justification to say that that can actually happen or that they are real. Yeah. Now the counter that we can raise is that if you go and say something as absurd as that, this is a very absurd thing for a brilliant philosopher to say. The counter is that I can conceive that the resurrection actually happened.
Yeah, that's what you can make a bunch.
You can make it up for anything.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned the infinitesimal teapot, because they use that as an argument to kind of disprove what we try to explain.
Like how exactly? Like as in?
So, the infinitesimal, the incredibly tiny teapot argument. Have you heard of that? Where there is a very very small teapot that is revolving around the Earth.
Yeah.
So we can say that that actually exists.
Hmm.
I think I'm butchering it. I have a
Yeah,
string of thought that I'm trying to.
Burton
go through.
Russell's teapot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Burton Russell's teapot, and essentially what they're trying to do is like we can say that that also exists, but we can't really prove that. That kind of goes against to what he's saying. I don't know.
No, so Burton Russell's teapot and the flying spaghetti monster, I think that Carl Sagan put out. The idea is that saying, what is the difference between no spaghetti monster? Okay, okay, I have to explain what this is.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So Burton Russell is an atheist philosopher. Carl Sagan is a famous cosmologist, both atheists. So they both came up with their own examples to try and counter theistic presentation. And I think this sort of resembles what Anthony Flew said, death by 1,000 qualifications. So I'll list out this really quickly. A teapot is flying in space, orbiting the Earth. It's super small that you can't use a telescope to find it, but it is there, right? That's the hypothesis. Now, Carl Sagan's flying spaghetti monster. There is a monster in my garage. Or some people vary that there is a fire-breathing dragon in my garage. It's invisible. It is cold-blooded, so you can't use infrared or something of that sort. The fire it breathes is of a specific kind, so you can't use infrared. You can't put dust on the floor to see its footprint because it's flying just 2 centimeters away higher from the ground, and all that stuff. So they ask with all of these stuff. The question is, what is the difference between a dragon or a flying spaghetti monster, whatever that is? What is the difference between something that you can't test, identify, figure out, and no flying spaghetti monster, right? And this is why I said it resembles.
And what is that what is that being used to disprove?
So it's saying that when you say, can you see God? Well, we say, no, you can't see God. Can you touch God? Well, you can't touch God. So they take along that line and they say, okay, what is the difference between a God whom you can't see, touch, smell, taste, and no God? Right? So it is along that line of pure empiricism where knowledge can come only through the sensory experience. Okay, so that was a stream of thought that was there in 1920s. It came up with the Vienna Circle and then it sort of died out because the people who propounded it themselves, I think around 50 years later, A.J. Iyer, if I recall right, he came back and said, no, this is a blunder. Right? The logical empiricism idea is that you can only have knowledge through your sensory experience. Like our 5 senses, whatever you can know through the five senses are the only things that you can really know.
Right.
Right. So that was the point. Now, what J L Mackie is saying is that this is a philosophical take on it. J L Mackie's whole point is this. He is, like I said, it's an absurd thing to
You
say.
can just
Conceive it. Then he's saying, okay, now it's up to you. Yes, it's up to you to show me that it really is impossible. The thing is, like I said, one thing is, just because you conceive doesn't mean that is really the case.
Okay.
The other thing is, you can twist it on its head and show that, well, I can conceive this to happen, that to happen, and I can conceive that there exists the greatest conceivable being who is the uncaused cause of the universe. Like, what is stopping me from conceiving it? I can conceive that stuff.
Yeah.
So I can conceive that the resurrection happened.
Yeah.
I can conceive that Jesus exorcised demons. I can conceive that Jesus healed the lame. So I can conceive anything and everything. So
Right.
J L Mackie's point sort of is,
Helps us more.
yeah, it's like shooting
Helps
himself
him.
in the foot.
Yeah.
So that is the first objection that J L Mackie put forward. And we are getting close to our time. And one thing to note is that he interestingly refers to Hume, to David Hume, right? And so, like I said, David Hume was a huge proponent of this empiricism idea. That you had to use only your sensory experience to know. And he
Oh, so
was,
it actually does tie up to what I said in a sense. Not really. I don't know.
not specifically. I think it may be interconnected, right? Because
Yeah.
these are all within the atheistic worldview. So when Burton Russell and Carl Sagan come and say they are working within the Weltanschauung of atheism, within the theoretical paradigm of atheism.
Right.
So their ideas and examples are going to be in line with what
The
is
whole
already.
sensory
the-
experience sort of.
It is going to be in line with the whole theoretical understanding of atheism, right? And so empiricism is a key thing. They still hold on to that. You can use only science to say. You can use only science to know. That is a different. That is a modified way of empiricism, right?
Okay.
Because you don't use science to figure out what love is. You use science to figure out what the chemicals are operating in your body. And they say you can use only science to know truth.
Right.
That is a modified take on empiricism. And so the interesting part with David Hume is that David Hume, when he wrote a letter to in 1720 or something, anyway in the 18th century, he wrote a letter and he said that he has never said something as absurd as that something could come without a cause. He said that I have never asserted so absurd a proposition that anything may arise without a cause. And then he went on to clarify saying, I know that this is false, that something can come without a cause. I know that it is false, not from intuition or demonstration, but from another effect. And he goes on with the writing. So the point is that David Hume himself, whom J L Mackie quotes, came and said that the premise basically he came and said that premise one of the Kalam is true. It's quite absurd. I would differ with you on how I know it is true, on what is the means or mechanism I know it is true. But I agree with the theist, basically. I'm an atheist philosopher, one of the person who is quoted most in objection to the miracles.
Right.
He said that miracles are completely impossible, improbable, you can never prove a miracle. But he basically came up and said, I agree with the theist on the Kalam, that something cannot come from nothing. And so that is the first part of it. We wanted to cover a bit more of that. But we hope that what we have touched on sort of enlightened you in a broader sense. And one thing that I also want to note is that, now this is very clear to you, we've discussed within this, and we have discussed this in the podcast also, that in terms of the content for the Natural Theology series, we are drawing heavily on Dr. William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith. Because we don't have to reinvent the wheel when we're doing this, when we're going through the content. What we want to do is we want to touch on the key parts that you get to learn and then use it in your evangelism and conversations. So we will have to pick and choose between what all objection to respond to. So now J L Mackie brings up a whole string of objections, and these are responded by philosophers. But if you get into it, then it starts going a bit over our head, right? It takes time for us to understand, and when you're listening, it also takes time for us to understand. And then you start to figure, am I ever going to use this in a conversation? Which is one of the reasons that I'm not really inclined to talk about the ontological argument. It's a brilliant philosophical argument. In fact, I was just pondering and seeing that it has a ramification even in economics.
Wow.
But the thing is, it gets too philosophical that you, for a moment, you stop and ask, which guy I know is ever going to come up and pick up a conversation on the ontological argument? But at the same time, you can learn more about other arguments that are going to be much more relevant for you to use. And other arguments that you can really comprehend really
I think
well.
the one that's most relatable is the teleological argument. Or
And the moral argument.
Yeah.
Both easily relatable to us. So we are going to look into that optimization of all of that and what to respond to within the series and all of that. But I just wanted to be clear that this is the content that we're drawing on, because this is a legitimate, well-resourced work from an experienced academic, sharp philosopher, and that is what we're presenting to you for your edification and for your knowledge. So yeah, thanks for sticking out, and we'll pick up the rest of the stuff in the next episode. Let's do that.
All right.
All right, see you.